Welcome to our talk with Dr. Lilliana Saldana. My name is Amy, and I am one of the librarians here at JPL. So for today, we're going to do a talk followed by a Q&A, and in a sec, I'm going to hand over the mic to our Dean of the Libraries, Dean Hendricks, and he will introduce Dr. Saldana.
Thank you, Amy. And Amy didn't plug one of the things that she's been just so successful here at UTSA, which is the Social Justice Book Club. If you don't know about it, talk to her. You've been running it for how long?
Since 2020.
Since 2020. We had a funder, Paul Furukawa, that funded the first bit of books, and we collaborate with L.T. Robinson in the Division of Student Affairs to introduce you to books you may not have read before that may open your mind and provide you new perspectives on the world. So I encourage you. It's one of our highly successful programs, and it's a lot of that has to do with Amy. So thank you, Amy. But the person you're here to see is Dr. Lilliana Saldana, who's right here to my right. Dr. Saldana is associate professor in Mexican American Studies, which is in race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality studies in the College of Education. And Dr. Saldana's research spans a lot. It's wide-ranging. Chicana feminist thought, foodways, political struggle and liberation theory. So Dr. Saldana is one of the people that we love collaborating with. Her knowledge is so broad. She's also, just so everybody knows here, also a native of San Antonio, and recently was involved with the Texas Indigenous Food Project. So the other thing that I have gotten to see on Facebook, because I follow Dr. Saldana, is the wonderful food she makes. So I think that's a good lead-in to Dr. Saldana, and I'm so happy that all of you have gotten to come here. So one of our big champions, and a big champion of her as well, Dr. Lilliana Saldana.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear in the back?
Okay, excellent. Well, I know that many of us are from different parts of Turtle Island, so I invite you to recognize and thank the indigenous caretakers of where you're living. I'd like to acknowledge the Payaya, the people of Yanaguana, and the Tapilanco Aquiltecans, who are native to the South Texas and Northeast Mexico region, who live in occupied territory known as San Antonio. I also acknowledge the Carrizo Come Crudo nation, whose traditional territory we are living on, as well as the Lipanapache, Tonkawa, Kickapoo, Comanche, and other native nations who were displaced from their territories and have endured much settler violence. Thank you for maintaining your traditional ways and taking care of our earth. Thank you to all the ancestors for the spiritual path that we walk today, for teaching us our human values. Thank you to the knowledge keepers in our families, the teachers who guide us on our path, and our community warriors who protect Mother Earth against policies that are detrimental to the land and the people. Thank you to all the visionaries who nurture our dreams and aspirations to create a world that is just and dignified for everyone, where respect is understood and practiced. And thank you to everyone here. Special thanks to Diane Lopez and Amy Bui. Thank you all for your presence, and I'm honored to share what I've learned and continue to learn from elders, practitioners of ancestral and traditional foods, scholars, and other knowledge keepers. Piali, Makwali Tonali, Nonotoka Lilliana Saldana. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Lilliana Saldana, and it is an honor to talk about and to share some of the knowledge that I've learned on my journey. So the focus of today's presentation is on Milpa Cuisine. How many of you have heard of Milpa, the word Milpa? Raise your hands. Okay, what is a Milpa? Anyone? What was that? The maize, right? The plants, the maize. Anyone else? I thought I saw another hand up. Okay, so we'll be talking about the Milpa as an agro-biodiverse approach to growing food, but also to nourishing our bodies and our communities. So I want to begin by just sharing a little bit about my personal journey and why I began to really dig deeper into this ancestral knowledge, the foods that my ancestors grew, and the foods that many in our communities, right? If you're Mexican American, if you're Mexican, if you're Central American, if you're Native American from present day United States, you have eaten these foods. So I am second generation. I'm a child of immigrants. I identify as a part of the larger indigenous diaspora. So diaspora has to do with being uprooted and displaced. So every generation in my family, as far as 4 generations, migrated, right? So my great grandmother was from the present state of Michoacán, Mexico, which is Occidental Mexico. Then she migrated north to San Luis Potosí, and from San Luis Potosí, they migrated to Monterrey, Nuevo León, and then to Yanaguana or San Antonio. And so growing and preparing traditional foods was a part of my ancestors' daily life. It was a part of their culture. It was a part of their worldview. I know when I've had conversations with my dad, who is from rural Zacatecas, from a small rancho outside of Tlaltenango de San Román, he often shares stories about how he would grow corn on the full moon, and that there were cycles in which they grew corn that were associated with these ancestral practices. He was often charged with looking for cal or lime, which is a mineral used to nixtamalize corn, right? So that is a part of an ancestral technology, right, of using cal. Before the use of cal, people used to use ash to cook their corn, and that's where the word nixtamalization comes from. And once they ran out of corn, because they would grow the corn, they would dry the corn, they would store the corn in this adobe structure that they built. But once the corn ran out, they would rely on quelites, or edible greens. And actually, quelites are the tender leaves. They're the edible greens that are small, right? They haven't matured. So my journey has been about recovering this knowledge, right? Recovering the knowledge of my ancestors, sharing this knowledge with this community, right? And I share this because I know that when my family immigrated to San Antonio, they began to get sick, right? They practically every single member of my family who has migrated and lived in San Antonio has diabetes or has died from complications of diabetes, right? So for me, learning about this knowledge and actually transitioning to a plant-based diet for me was a matter of life or death. And so it is quite an honor, and I'm very humbled to share what I have learned on my journey. Okay, so just a little bit about where I am sort of drawing from this knowledge that I'm sharing with you, right? Because this is sort of a representation of my evolving conocimiento or knowledge as a student of ancestral foods, right? So I'm so incredibly grateful to Chicana feminist and queer scholars like Luz Calvo and Catriona Esquivel, who wrote this groundbreaking book called Decolonize Diet. This book, when it was published about 7 years ago, was groundbreaking, and it changed my life. It was life-changing. I've also learned a lot from food practitioners in San Antonio, beginning with my grandmother, beginning with my mother, beginning with all the matriarchs in my family, and also food practitioners in Mexico, right? Indigenous food practitioners. So that's a image of me as a mole workshop in Tepoztlán, Mexico. There's also a growing literature in Chicanx studies. And so I'm very honored to teach UTSA's inaugural course on Mexican-American foodways. I see some of my students here. Thank you for being here. And so that literature has also been important in centering this knowledge and really communicating the importance of this research in our communities. And of course, there is I wish this was a day-to-day practice for me, but I truly enjoy preparing foods. And so some of the images that I share with you are some of the dishes that I've made. And of course, the image on the upper left is from the Florentine Codex. So now our writers documented a lot of their knowledge about what we call now ancestral plants, ancestral foods, and these post-colonial codices. And so in these codices, they're writing about the different plants, the different foods that they grew, how they would harvest the foods, how they would prepare the foods. They would document the culinary uses of the plants as well as the medicinal uses of the plants. Okay, so what is the first thing you see when you see this image? Are there foods here that you recognize? Which are new to you? Might be a little hard to see. Cactus? You see the cactus, the nopales? How many of you have had nopalitos or cactus? Yes, definitely a part of the Mesoamerican diet. And the Texas, right? The Texas diet. Yes. That is a pineapple. Yes. Yes. The pineapple is Mesoamerican.
I say it's interesting because people used to buy a pineapple to rent out to parties as a status symbol. Wait, colors or odors like.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of these foods were taken from Mexico, Central America to Europe. And not just the foods, but our books, our codices. Many of our codices are not in Mexico or, where they were written. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah, las tunas, right? The prickly pears. And there's a variety of prickly pears, right? From the sweet to also the bitter. The bitter are not very common, but if I've seen them here, if you go to the nopaleros, right, or the nopal plants, you might see some of the bitter tunas. The bitter tunas are different from the sweet tunas in that the seeds are all in the middle, and you scoop them out, and you can use them to cook your frijoles. That is how my grandmother cooked her beans. And that's a very traditional recipe from the San Luis Potosi region. But this photo represents the universe of foods that were grown and cultivated in what scholars call Mesoamerica or present-day Mexico and Central America. Okay. So, my goodness, there's so much that I want to share with you. And I want to begin by talking about Mesoamerican agriculture because I think it's really important to understand that this region, right, was inhabited by a number of Mesoamerican societies, including the Totonacos from present-day Veracruz, the Maya from present-day Yucatan, Quintana Roo, Campeche. You also have the Toltecs from central Mexico, the Zapotecs from present-day Oaxaca, and the grandmother civilization, which are the Olmecs. So these societies developed an ancient and quite distinctive invention of agriculture, and they developed and created instruments and distinctive forms to work the land and organize their work. They domesticated a variety of plants that adapted to the diversity of ecological conditions of the region through a process that was initiated thousands of years ago and that continued to develop in spite of European colonization. So the milpa is one of those traditional ways of growing food that continues to exist this day, and we continue to eat many of the foods that come from the milpa. So prior to European colonization, indigenous agriculture had reached a very complex level. They perfected their agriculture not only through their instruments, but their agricultural methods and through its broad variety of domesticated plants, which included corn, squash, and beans, which are often referred to as the Three Sisters by indigenous peoples here in present-day United States and occupied territory. This region is regarded as the origin and center of genetically diverse foods. It's also the site of a vast number of cultivated foods in the history of humanity. So many varieties corn is Mesoamerican. Beans, the majority of beans grown in the world, many of them come from Central Mexico, Central America, and the same thing with squash. Many of the squash varieties are from present-day Mexico and Central America. And many of them were taken, exported, through the colonial period all over the world. So if you look at a map of the origin of foods, many of our world's foods come from this part of the world. This part of the world. It is quite amazing. So corn, right, is sort of like that central food, right? That eje céntrico, right? That sort of main staple of Mesoamerican societies. And Chicano studies scholar Roberto Cintle Rodriguez, que en paz descanse, refers to corn as the civilizational impulse, right? So it was basically what led to the creation of many of these societies that continue to grow food through the Milpa approach and who continue to basically develop this Milpa cuisine. So the same people, right, who developed these urban centers, the same people who built these civilizations were the ones who relied on maize as their daily sustenance. And they're the same people, right, today who continue, right, and we're a part of this civilization. Many of us here are a part of this civilizational impulse. Continue to nurture our communities and our families through these main foods of squash, beans, and maize. So anytime you eat corn, when you eat calabacitas, when you eat frijoles, remember that this is literally thousands of years old, right? Thousands of years old. The milpa is considered an ancestral polyculture, which means that it is a simultaneous approach to cultivating various plants. And I will also say insects, because oftentimes we focus on like corn, squash, and beans. But there are, the milpa is really a biodiverse ecosystem that includes insects, that includes pollinators, that includes skelites or edible greens. So milpa cuisine is really based on this, I would say this symbiotic relationship between all of these plants, right? And as you can see in the image, the corn, right? I don't know if any of you have seen cornfields or have grown corn, but corn grows very tall, right? I tried to grow corn this summer, and this heat was quite terrible for my corn. But it grows very tall, right? And so the milpa approach uses the corn as that vertical support for beans, which wrap around. They're like vines. They wrap around the corn, right? And the beans provide the soil with nitrogen, which the soil needs, right? So that the plants all flourish. And then at the bottom, you'll see the squash, which if any of you have grown squash, it tends to take over, right? It grows vertically. And squash is really important because it helps trap the moisture, right, in the milpa. Every part of the milpa is consumed, right? So don't think it's just the kernels of corn, right? So the milpa has also produced cooking techniques, namely steaming, right? I always think of tamales, right? Which we steam. Thinking of roasting, asar, los chiles, asar, right? The different ways in which you can roast. There's the grinding technique, right? Every time, in some communities, they still grind corn. But I'm thinking of grinding, for example, tomates, chiles, ajos, right? That you need for a salsa. Also, the nixtamalization process is an indigenous cooking technique that comes out of growing corn, right? Out of the milpa. And then there's also the technique of tatemar, right? And I can't think of a translation in English. I don't know that if there's a correct translation or a translation that fully captures what this word means. How many of you have heard of the word tatemar? Brenda, what is tatemar? What does it mean to tatemar?
It is like to burn, like for example, like tortillas tatemadas that are like kind of like carbonized, like I don't know how to
Yes. And that's an indigenous cooking technique, right? When you actually roast something directly on fire, right? Maybe some of you have seen poblano peppers roasted directly on the fire, right? That is what it means to tatemar. There's also tortear, right? How many of you have heard this term? Tortear, cuando torteas algo. It means to, right? Have you ever seen people make fresh corn tortillas or even flour tortillas? That tortear, and then you put it on the comal directly and it cooks, right? This is another cooking technique that emerged from the milpa and other bioagricultural methods. Okay, so you can actually create a universe of dishes with a milpa. What are some dishes that you can think of based on these foods? That you've had at home, that you've maybe had at a restaurant, at a taqueria. Caldo, yes. Right? The squash, the corn, usually corn cobs, cut in half. Anyone else? Calabacita con pollo, yes. Was that you? Yeah. Okay, yes. Calabacita con pollo, right? Squash with chicken. And that is a dish that, I know here in the Texas-Mexico borderlands is a very traditional dish. Calabacitas con puerco, right, with pork. And pork was introduced via colonization. Rajas con calabacitas, or, right, roasted peppers, poblano peppers with squash. Right, so there are a variety of dishes. But you can also make tamales, right? Because every part of the milpa is used. Every part. You can use the fresh corn leaves or you can dry them. And of course, if you've had a tamal, you know that you had to unwrap the tamal, right, with the dried corn husk. Okay, so the milpa continues to be an essential part of people's diet. And I'm not talking about our, ancestors of the past, but also people of the present. Right. And so every time we interact or we have even a tortilla chip, we are engaging in this ancestral practice. OK, let me go back. OK, so again, right, the milpa not only includes the three sisters, but also insects, also pollinators, quelites or edible grains. I know that in some communities, they actually collect or harvest some of the insects and they actually do consume them. It's a part of people's diet because it is a source of protein for many communities. And again, it's not just, right, the milpa doesn't just reflect these sort of ancestral techniques and skills like sowing and planting and seed saving and harvesting, right? Because you want to save the best seeds for the next, the next cosecha, the next harvest. But it also includes includes this common vision and the values like reciprocity and respect for the land, right? Respect for all living beings in the milpa, right? Our plant relatives, our animal relatives. Most of the time, right? And it's hard to, I don't know who has a milpa here in town. I know I have tried to grow corn, but never together with beans and squash. I have grown squash separately, right? But I have never grown them together. I'm still learning how to grow some of these plant relatives. But in many communities, right, your milpa can be small. It can be as big as this room here. So it requires collective labor. Oftentimes, it requires the labor of everyone in a household. And we know that this collective labor has made, quote unquote, the evolution through domestication possible over the generations because the people were, saving the best seeds and then growing the next harvest, right? So the next crop. Okay, so a milpa sometimes can include wild species, right, of plants, but also domesticated plants. For example, in Mexico, there are at least 60 varieties of corn. And depending where you live, you're gonna plant different varieties, right? So for example, in central Mexico, they might plant cacahuacitle, which is the white corn. It's usually the corn that is used for pozoles. Menudo, if any of you have had menudo, if any of you had pozole, In Veracruz, they might grow the tuxpeño. In Oaxaca, they grow a smaller variety of corn called the bolita, and it comes in a variety of colors. And then in northern Mexico, there's a cuanico norteño, right? So if you're from Monterrey, the Monterrey region, or the northern Mexico region, they might grow this kind of corn, right? So it's not the same variety of corn. There's like at least, I know there's more than 60 varieties, about 64. But again, going back to corn, right? Corn is central to the Milpa. We know that our ancestors viewed corn as very sacred, right? Many of our origin stories, I'm going to go to this slide first. Many of our origin stories, whether it's a Zapotec origin story, whether it's an origin story by the Cacashlas of present-day Tlaxcala, whether it's Mayan, they all go to corn as sort of like the origin of where we come from. We are made from corn. Somos gente de maíz, right? And that mural on the far right, you can see little heads coming out of the corn. They're like the corn cobs, right? This is a symbolic representation that we are made out of corn. We are gente de maíz, maíz being corn, right? And this is a beautiful mural in Cacaxla, which is now an archaeological site. There's a mural painting in present-day San Bartolo, Guatemala. This was possibly painted 250 years BC to 250 AD, and it also documents the origins of humans through corn. And then the image on the far left is the origins of people from corn as depicted in the Codex Borbanicus, which was written slightly before or after the conquest. There isn't an exact date for this codex, but it's one of the very few codices that weren't burned and that still exist, right? So many of our stories about how we came to be are documented in glyphs. They're documented in murals. They're documented in codices. So these are two codices that I often refer to, right? The Florentine Codex, which is actually written after during the colonial period in the years right after the Spanish invasion. And the image on the left is the Codex Borgia, which captures the image of a woman with a child on her back, grinding corn on the metate, right? And so these are just, to me, they're absolutely beautiful images of how sacred corn is, right? The image on the far right, right, is an image of a woman blessing corn. Every time you see the little scrolls in the codices, it means that they are speaking, right? That's the speech. That's the symbol for speech. And the image in the middle are women who are offering corn to Chicomecoatl, who is one of the goddesses or deities of corn. So corn is definitely very central, right? It is, for this reason, Roberto Rodriguez refers to maíz as a ceremonial discourse, and it's a 7,000-year-old ceremonial discourse. And discourse has to do with how we speak and how we understand, right? So we know that corn was domesticated more than 7,000 years ago. Imagine 7,000 years of domesticating corn and producing the variety. The most fascinating aspect of corn is that corn does not grow on its own. It requires human intervention, which means that people were saving the seeds, sharing them, exchanging them, and growing corn. And so we can see that corn traveled to Central America, to South America. It traveled to the north, right? From Central Mexico, it then traveled to the north, to present-day United States, all the way to present-day East Coast, to the Midwest, all over, right? So it proliferated because people were exchanging and sharing those seeds. So indigenous peoples were trading with each other, right? They were communicating with each other, and they were learning about their foods. And I have to stress that because oftentimes we think that indigenous peoples lived in isolation from each other before the conquest. And that is not true. Okay. So, again, every time you have a gordita, you have tamales, you have tortillas, think of this as engaging and participating in this 7,000-year-old ceremonial discourse. The practice of eating maíz, of engaging in this daily ritual of sustenance, right? Our ancestors who grew corn, right? And they provided for their families and their communities and these societies over thousands of years. This is something that we still practice today, right? Every time we have maize. And I know I am very, very, I almost feel like I'm super attached to maize. I have to have at least one corn tortilla a day. I have to. I didn't have my first flour tortilla until I was like 13, 14 years old. And I remember going to downtown San Antonio to a little restaurant right by San Fernando Cathedral. And it was the first time I'd ordered a bean and cheese taco. I was 13 years old and it was on flour. And I thought I was in heaven because I had never had a flour tortilla. My grandmother always made corn tortillas. And so, going back to corn, right? It is definitely a part of many of our diets, right? And it is this ancestral practice, right, of thousands and thousands of years. So, many of us, I'm thinking of UTSA being an HSI, where many of us might be of Mexican descent, right, or Central American descent. And even if many of us are detribalized, we are part of that historical process that led to the creation of gente de maíz. We are connected to that. Right? Because oftentimes when, I teach Mexican American studies, so one of the major topics is always identity, right? I have students who are like, what do I call myself? Am I Hispanic? Am I Latina? Am I Chicana? Am I Tejana? Am I, what do I call myself? And this is why I appreciate Dr. Roberto Sintli's work, because he says, it's, the question shouldn't be, sometimes the question has been, how indigenous are we, right? Because we're always trying to understand who we are, where we come from, right? Am I indigenous enough? What makes you indigenous? And so I really like that Roberto Sintli just sort of, he asks a very different question, right? And he's telling us, we are detribalized, right? Many of us may not know our indigenous origins, right? Because of colonization, because of detribalization, but we are connected to this historical process that led to the gente de maíz. And that, to me, has been so enlightening. Okay. So now I want to talk about frijoles, right? Frijoles has literally saved my day. Many days, actually. When I don't have time to cook, I will always make at least one pot of frijoles. And as a vegetarian, I have learned to cook a variety of beans. I think I have about 15 to 20 beans at home that I keep in jars. And I have learned so much from our bean relatives. How many of you, I'm assuming many of you have had beans. What are your favorite beans? Yes. Black beans. Oh, yeah. They're my favorite too. One of my favorites. Anyone else?
Me encantan los garbanzos.
Oh, los garbanzos. I love those too. They are my absolute, they're in the top pantry. I have a lot, but those are like my top 5. Black beans and garbanzos. Yes. Anyone else? Black-eyed peas? Yes, absolutely, yes. I wasn't sure if I had heard you correctly. Yes, black-eyed peas, absolutely. I know, and I've heard them in Mexico, people call them frijol de carita, I think, which I wasn't sure. Yeah, I had never heard of it in Spanish. Anyone else? Yes. Kidney beans, absolutely.
Pinto.
Yes, right. If your ancestors, or if you come from the northern part of Mexico, Zacatecas, Durango, Texas, right, even present-day Texas, chances are you have had pinto beans at a restaurant, at home, at someone's birthday party, quinceañera, wedding, right? Barbecue. Pinto beans are a part of our cuisine, and it is a part of the Milpa cuisine. So there are 4 major varieties of corn in Mexico, including the frijol común, or the common bean, which includes the pinto. There's the comba, which are the creamier beans, like the butter beans, the lima beans. There's the ayocote. And I had never had ayocotes until a few years ago. And ayocote comes from the Nahuatl word ayocotli. And it is actually one of the larger variety of heirloom beans. And they are just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, they come in a variety of colors. Some of them are pintos or spotted, right? So there's ayocote morado, which is the purple variety. There's ayocote negro, which is like the black variety. There's ayocote blanco, ayocote amarillo, which is kind of like a butterscotch color, just this magnificent color, really. But there are a variety of ayocotes, and then there's the tepary bean, which is a very small bean that grows very well in arid conditions or dry conditions. So it's grown like in present day, like Arizona. I know that there are some communities that grow tepary beans, like in Guatemala, and it's a huge part of their diet. But we know that one of the vegetable proteins consumed the most on this planet is the bean, and it's cultivated all over the world. Many scholars believe that a majority of the beans consumed globally come from present-day Mexico and Central America. We know that Andean people, pre-colonization, were growing beans as well. Many scientists believe that the common ancestor was from Mesoamerica. And we know that people were growing and cultivating beans at least 10,000 years ago. So this is actually much older than corn. Okay. So I don't know if I have another. Okay, yes. Okay. So like corn, every part of the plant is edible. I know oftentimes we might be familiar with the dried beans, which we get at the grocery store, but you can actually, if you grow your beans, and if you go to maybe some grocery stores like La Michoacana, you can get fresh garbanzos. You can get fresh beans from the pods, and you can make a variety of dishes. You can also eat the vines and the flowers from the bean plant. So I always like to quote Luz Calvo and Catriona Esquivel, who wrote Decolonizer Diet, right? Cooking a pot of beans is a micro-revolutionary act that honors our ancestors and the generations to come, right? A simple and humble pot of beans. And let me tell you, there are times when I have absolutely no time to cook, right? And I imagine many of us here don't have time to cook, right? And when I make a pot of beans, you can make so many dishes from one simple pot of beans, like a pot of frijoles, like a pinto beans. I have made bean salads. I have made enfrijoladas, which are like enchiladas, but wrapped in a bean puree, which are absolutely delicious. You can even just make, serve yourself a bowl of frijoles with a little queso, maybe some conchitas. Who doesn't like conchitas, right? Yeah, that's the working class food I grew up with. So beans are an essential part of Milpa cuisine. The other thing I wanted to share is that beans are very high in fiber. They help regulate blood sugar levels, and they lower cholesterol. Beans aid in the prevention of constipation, digestive disorders, diverticulitis. The high fiber content in many of these beans, and for example, lima beans, prevents blood sugar levels from rising too rapidly after eating them due to their presence of large amounts of absorption-slowing components in the beans. Our ancestors understood that when you combine and you eat corn with beans, that is a dynamic duo. And this dynamic duo isn't just particular to Mexican people or Central American people or our ancestors, right? Many people around the world pair, right, a grain with a bean, right? So people understood that when you combine corn with beans, that it is the perfect, most complete protein, particularly if you pair more beans with the corn, right? Corn is a huge source of carbohydrates, right? The beans are a source of protein. So when you have your tostadas with frijoles, remember that you are actually eating a diet, right, that was created by our ancestors, and that is a perfect source of nourishment, right? So many of these beans are very high in fiber, phosphorus, iron, potassium, magnesium, and many other minerals and vitamins. So make sure you eat your frijoles, please. Okay. Yes.
I just want to say that in Mexico, we make that joke with, like, for example, if you're afraid to open a jar and you're like, you can't because you're feeling like you're not strong enough, we say, like, no comió frijoles.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, right. It actually provides you with the nourishment you need, right? Yeah. Right, carbs, right? And the protein. Yeah. It is actually the perfect diet. And our ancestors knew that. And we continue to eat this combination, right? It is an ancestral dynamic duo. The other thing I wanted to share is I know I'm running a little bit out of time, but I do want to talk about the squash and the pumpkins, right? Because there are a variety of calabazas, right? I think if you are, let's see, I know I grew up with calabacitas, which are the small calabazas that you might see at the grocery store, HEB, right? Not the zucchini, but the lighter green colored, right? But there are an enormous variety of squash. In the US or in English, they call them pumpkins too. In Mexico, there's no distinction between squash and pumpkin. It's just calabaza. And every part of the pumpkin or the squash, I would say pumpkin. I'm going to focus on pumpkin because you'll have that reference, right? But every part of the pumpkin can be eaten, right? The seeds, the vines, the leaves, and you can eat these in soups. You can saute them or steam them. That is a part of the ancestral diet. And to eat these vines, they're also considered a quelite, by the way. You can consume them and eat them in a taco on corn tortillas. But these are just examples of the many kinds of calabazas. Okay, and these are just examples. I don't know why. Okay. These are just examples of some of the dishes I have made with squash or pumpkin, right? Maybe some of you are familiar with sweetened pumpkin, right? Pumpkin that's been cooked in piloncillo or cane sugar, which is considered a very traditional dish. And I cooked this with amaranth and quinoa. There's also the decolonizer diet has an excellent recipe for vegan cheese using pumpkin seeds. It is so delicious. And of course, when you eat them with tortillas or corn chips, that is a part of the Milpa diet. And I've also made a salsa with ground pumpkin, and habaneros and onion and tomatoes. It's a very traditional Yucatec salsa that's called siquilpac. And here I paired it with some large ayocote beans, or I think they're corona beans, but they're quite large and they are absolutely delicious. We know that people were grinding pepitas or pumpkin seeds thousands of years ago. It's one of the, I would say, in Oaxaca, Mexico, archaeologists found remnants of pumpkin seed powder in central Mexico and also in Guatemala. No, I'm sorry, in Oaxaca, in the Gila Naquitz cave in Oaxaca, right? So they were cultivating and growing calabazas as far as 10,000 years ago. Again, right? We're looking at the cultivation of these crops, right? Of these plants, calabaza, right? Squash, pumpkin, beans, and corn at least 10,000 years ago. Okay. So I'm going to go to the quelites because oftentimes we focus on the three sisters, right? Beans, corn, and squash. But quelites or edible greens are an essential part of the Milpa cuisine, right? So pumpkin vines and pumpkin squash and pumpkin vines and leaves are considered quelites or edible greens. You can actually eat those. I'm thinking of just some of these that are listed here, right? Chapil is a quelite. It often grows in some milpas in southern Mexico. Amaranth, epazote. Maybe some of you are familiar with epazote. I know that a little sprig at HEB is like $3. It's so expensive. I think it's very expensive. There's papaloquelite. There's huazotle. There's verdolagas or purslane. Xocoyoli. And there's squash pumpkin vines. Now, many of these can be cooked. They can be steamed. And they can be eaten. They're traditionally eaten in a tortilla, right? So think of this as like spinach, like when you saute spinach, except that many of these quelites have more iron than spinach, okay? Some of these galitas you can add to beans. They're traditionally made with beans, a pot of beans. You can just throw the purslane in your pot of beans or your epazote. There are hundreds of varieties of galites. I mean, there are about 350 species that have been identified in Mexico. Imagine 350 different species of galites. And this map here only includes like a dozen. And we know that people have been cultivating these. I do have a few. I've been able to grow a few of these galites at home, and I will share this with you because we're dealing with a climate crisis, right? And it's very hard to grow some of these galites. Some of these grow, you'll see them on the sidewalk, especially amaranth. You'll see purslane, right, in the cracks of the sidewalk. You can harvest those if you want. Make sure they're not in high traffic areas. You want to be careful. But hoja santa does really well in this Texas heat, and that's something that I'm learning as I'm growing the food, because I want to make sure that we can share this knowledge with community, and that some of these can be easily incorporated into our diet, right? So. The hoja santa is so good. You can eat it, and I eat it in salads. If you want to make a green mole, which is a traditional mole, I think many of us are more familiar with the chocolate-based mole, but there are a variety of moles. I mean, literally a universe of moles. But this is indispensable when you're making green mole or pipián verde, like a pumpkin-based green mole. You can try to substitute some of these ingredients, but this leaf is indispensable. Yes. There's chaya, which I know I've shared in community. This plant, and I call it a displaced relative, because this plant is originally from like the Yucatan region, right? It's used a lot in Maya cuisine. But this does exceptionally well in this heat. And it is colloquially referred to as Mexican spinach because it has a lot more iron than regular spinach. But I made some empanadas with the chaya leaf. So I chopped it up. I mixed it in the masa. And then I made some empanadas, corn empanadas, and topped it with the pepita salsa. So again, right, you're looking at the Milpa Cuisine. And purslane. Purslane grows everywhere. You have to notice though, right? So learn as much as you can, learn how to visually identify some of these plants, because you'll see that they grow in many places, even in high traffic streets. But purslane is another source of nourishment, and it's very good with beans or with a stew. Okay, so I want to just end this talk by sharing this beautiful image. It's a sculpture of a young maize god made in Copan, Honduras. It was a commemorative piece that was created in 715 AD, and then it was stolen by a British archaeologist, and it is still in, I believe, in the British Museum. But this, how many of you have seen this, a reference to this image? Where have you seen this? So sorry. You can finish what you're eating.
I saw images of it whenever I was doing some research.
Okay, so you've seen the image. Okay. How many of you have seen, anyone else seen a reference to this image in popular culture? Yes. Yeah, I always feel like Tenoch Huerta kind of looked like he was doing some Dragon Ball Z type of thing there. And I just know because I have my little brother used to, he was obsessed with Dragon Ball Z when he was little. But yes, right, this actually means, right, to give and to receive. That we have a responsibility, right, that a social responsibility, right? It means that whenever we give, that we can receive. When we receive, that we give. This idea of reciprocity to the land and to our foods and to the people, right? Dr. Cinsley Rodriguez refers to this particular idea as being based on maize, right? This is a maize-based epistemology or knowledge system, right? This idea of reciprocity of giving and receiving is based on the cultivation of maize, right? Whenever you grow a plant, right, you care for it. And you know that when you care for it, you will receive, right, a good harvest, right? So this is just one of the many values that he identified as being based on corn and the cultivation of corn, this human value. And of course, this idea of giving and receiving it's kind of a universal, golden rule that exists in many cultures, right? But this in particular is rooted in maize, right? The cultivation of corn, right? So growing a milpa and even eating milpa-based foods is part of sustaining a healthy ecosystem. So thank you so much. I don't know if anyone has questions.
Hey. Can you hear me? Okay. So we have a couple minutes for a Q&A, and you might have noticed my coworkers are bringing out the food, which is being served by Nako today. So we'll bring it out slowly, wedding style. So if anyone wants to eat, just, let them know. And so if anyone has any questions, what?
Yes.
What? Oh. And drinks. If you want a drink, you can come up and grab one from there. We also have tables around the room before you leave, that where you can pick up like buttons and look at some of the items in our special collections related to this topic.
I think there's a question in there.
Yes.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to know, do you think when we stopped cooking with lard, that kind of led to our downfall in the health as far as like diabetes and those types of illnesses?
I would say that that's part of it. I think that, and I know many scholars have identified, they've actually called it the Latino paradox. When immigrants, from Mexico, many of them are poor or working class, right? They immigrate precisely so that they can have better economic opportunities. They actually have better health than immigrants who have been here the longest, or even U.S. born people. The longer immigrants stay here, the worse they get in terms of their health. But it's also like it's the colonized diet, right? Fried foods, highly processed foods, sugars, refined sugars, breads, right? Like foods that are based on refined flour. And we know that in some of the indigenous documents, like when indigenous peoples, like right during the conquest, when they started eating bread, they used to call it sick people's food, because they were getting sick from eating bread because they weren't used to eating bread. So a lot of it is sort of these refined foods, highly processed foods, corn syrup. So eating fresh foods, fresh vegetables is so critical to reclaiming our health.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
I want to ask, why is hard to find the white corn? Like every time I go to the HEB, it's like yellow corn everywhere. Why? And where I can find the white corn?
Yeah, the sweet corn, right? Which is like a genetically modified corn, right? And I remember we had some guests from Mexico visit us last week, and I invited them over for a caldo, and it had sweet corn, and they were like, "Wow, this corn is really sweet." Because they were used to the white corn. Very few places have white corn, which is like a non-genetically modified corn that comes from Mexico. But you can find sometimes you can find it at Chicho Boys. Sometimes. Yeah. That's why it's so important that we grow our own corn. Like if we want food sovereignty and we want the ability to eat our ancestral foods, we have to grow our own food. And I'm not just talking about at the individual level. We're going to have to find collective ways of growing foods and learning how to prepare these foods so that, we can be healthy as a community.
Professor.
Yes.
I was going to ask, I saw among the grains, etc., that were being cultivated, the chaya, I had heard as a medicinal. Are we also looking to the milpa for medicinals, herbal remedies, home remedies that our curanderismo might incorporate?
Absolutely. I don't know much about the foods that grow specifically in the milpa that have like medicinal use, but like all the foods that are in the milpa, like even the chaya, the epazote, the chipil, they have many minerals and vitamins, so that when we eat them, they're critical. They're a critical part of our diet. But there are certain plants that do have like medicinal, I would say, that are used for medicinal purposes in teas.
As we think about this in the context of universities and Hispanic serving institutions specifically, universities and resources, they can vary in different circumstances, but is this something that can be used in food pantries to address food insecurity, but also like having cultural significance and ties to historical culture specific to HSIs?
Yeah.
Is that like realistic on how we can approach it in that policy perspective?
Yes. I know that, like, for example, this week we had some folks from the Food Policy Council come to my foodways class, and they talked about the work and trying to really, it's a food sovereignty project, right? Like, so how can we grow foods, like ancestral foods that are going to be accessible to large communities, right? So, for example, I might grow corn, or I might grow chaya, I might grow some of these foods, and I have them in pots. I actually don't have a lot of soil, I have a tiny front yard. I have a tiny backyard. I have a small patio on the sides of my house, but it's cement. So I have to grow everything in pots. So I have to find a way. How can I reclaim the milpa within my conditions, right? And then how can we make sure that people learn about these, for example, these edible grains, the foods of the milpa, and then learn how to prepare foods with these plants, right? Because I know, like, if someone had given me a bag of beans like 30 years ago, I probably would have not known what to do with it. Like I would be like, well, I don't know what to do with this bag of beans. But I think that there has to, at the municipal level, there isn't, I haven't seen a huge response to addressing food insecurity, right? And addressing food insecurity within the context of ancestral foods and food sovereignty. So there's definitely a need to figure out how can we ensure that our communities have access to our ancestral foods, because I will tell you the standard American diet of industrialized foods is killing people in our communities. So how can we reclaim these plants? How can we learn about chaya? How can we learn about chipil? How can we grow it in a way where people have access to these foods? And it's not going to cost you $2 to get 3 sprigs of epazote at HEB, right? Because that's how much it costs for 3 little sprigs, 3 little leaves. When we can grow it, when we can teach each other how to save the seeds, how to grow, but we have to develop that relationship with our plants, and that's something that I'm still learning. I'm growing epazote and I'm learning, okay, what does this epazote plant need? How can I care for it, right? So that it can then give back. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Thank you, Liliana. One last question.
Yeah, I was wondering how comida casera relates to the Milpa diet plan. I'm wondering if you view it more as a negative aspect because it involves a lot more grease and like puffy tacos, dealing with, all that kind of stuff. Would you see it as something that we need to re-educate, as something negative, or do you think we should still keep it in our daily diet?
Oh my gosh, puffy tacos. I love puffy tacos. And I'm totally okay with an occasional tortilla de harina, right? And a puffy taco, but not as like my everyday diet, right? Because food has evolved, right? We have had to learn how to make the best with what we have access to. We know that indigenous peoples didn't have access to their foods, to the traditional foods, when they were displaced, right? And then they were forced to live on land where you couldn't really grow anything, right? And so they had to make fry bread with flour, right? Many of our people only had access to flour instead of corn here in Texas, right? And that's where flour tortillas became so popular here in Texas, but also northern Mexico, right? So to me, it's a journey, right? It's really learning from the plants, from our plant relatives. It's learning how to prepare foods. I mean, there's so many levels of that learning. I've tried to grow chickpeas so many times since the pandemic, since 2020, and I've not been successful. I've been successful in germinating them, and then they die. This is the first time I tried it. I grow papalo quelite, which is another quelite, and I grow this tall. But it took me 3 years to learn from this plant relative, It's been a huge learning journey. But yeah, I would say that I'm always about baby steps and small steps. Small steps, right? Small steps.
Thank you again to Dr. Lilliana Saldana for joining us today. And you're such an inspiration. I can't even keep my baby cactus alive, and you have all of these things going on. So I'm always like impressed by you. And I'd also like to take a second to thank my team, who you might have seen around the room today, like the staff and the student workers. And lastly, thanks to all of you for showing up here today to learn with us, and I hope you enjoy the food. And if you signed in out there in the sheet that was going around earlier, we could also send out resources and everything afterwards, so you have access to it, because we're librarians, so we just have to share those. Naco. Yes. Yeah.
I think it's located in Los Patios on 410. It's like looks like a little forest, and you go in. Oh, okay. Excellent. I love your the space you have. It's gorgeous. Surrounded by trees. It's so beautiful.
I need to get out there. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll be hanging around for a little bit. So
excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you.